The Founding Fathers, American Revolution, our Constitution, our history, America. Thanks so much for tuning in as we discuss the people, places, events, and battles that turned 13 separate colonies into the greatest nation on earth, the United States. Hey everybody, I am so happy to be back and appreciate your patience and understanding with the lengthy delay in getting this episode out. As many of you may have read or seen on our website or via social media, my wife, my son, and I suffered quite serious accidents here on our ranch. And not to bore you with all the details, but I was thrown from my four-wheeler and banged up exceptionally good. I was black and blue and purple for weeks. No broken bones. My son burned his hand on the tractor. After he saw that happen, he jumped off, and unbeknownst to him, he grabbed the nearest thing to help him with the jump, and that happened to be the exhaust. And more significantly was my wife got kicked in the eye by our llama, and that actually was pretty brutal. It burst her eyeball. We had to have emergency eye surgery. We're all good. Her vision is back. That is in part why the lengthy delay. So again, I appreciate your patience with this. And it's a good time to remind you that my goal with this podcast is to really provide an understanding of how our country was formed, and of course talk about the people and events and the battles. And I'd like to talk about a lot of things that aren't like mainstream or people that you may not have heard of. So we're also going to be doing periodically little mini bios on some key figures as well as non-key figures, and all of those were critical at some point and in some way for the revolution. So you're going to get a wide range of information. I'd love to have 2 episodes a month going forward. And with the lengthy delay that we've had in getting this out, I'm eager to get as many as I can over the next few months. So who knows, maybe I'll have more than 2 a month, but that's the goal I'm shooting for. And with every person, battle, or little known fact that I come across in my reading and studying, it seems like another rabbit hole is opened, and it's such a joy to investigate and learn about it, and to know what I'm getting is accurate and not just legend. Of course, those are fun too, but getting those firsthand accounts based on the writing or diary or journals, it's a thrill for me to have you here, which tells me that you're also interested in more than just the basics about the American Revolution. So again, I'm just glad that you're here. For those of you just tuning in for the first time, personally, I read and learn anything and everything I can about the Revolution. My 5th great-grandfather, whose name was Peter Kern, and his 2 brothers fought in the war, and they lived in the state of Pennsylvania. He owned a mill, and a city was named after him, and they called that Kernsville. And my wife and I, a couple years ago, went back and visited his grave and his mill. And kind of cool information is in my research of him and all that he was involved with. Benjamin Franklin visited and purchased supplies from him, and that was in a newspaper out of Pennsylvania. So all of that information will be available in our show notes. I'm also a member of the Sons of the American Revolution. I have a tattoo of George Washington's signature on my arm, and we even own a lock of George Washington's hair. I'm just simply passionate, intrigued, and fascinated by everything surrounding the war. Want my countless hours spent researching and digging in and uncovering secrets or things that haven't been really discussed yet. I want to share all those with you. So thanks for tuning in. I'm beginning my historical fiction. It's going to be my 3rd book called Brothers in Arms, and it's about my 5th great-grandfather Peter and his 2 brothers. I'll have a little more information on that in the show notes. Lastly, before we get into our episode, I want to share a couple changes that I've made, and I think you're going to really like it and hopefully find it beneficial. Each episode is now going to be linked on our website under our podcast page. And within that, starting on this show, we'll have show notes. And what those show notes are going to include are links, primary resources, photos, any video or documentary or any information that is related to what I discuss is going to be listed all in a neat, tidy place for you. You can still see a summary of each show on the platform that you actually use, where you get your podcasts, but I really recommend that you visit our website for all this new information, and I think it really adds a tremendous amount of value to you. Listening to the show, and then you can, couple that with the show notes, I feel will bring it more alive and more engaging. And would love your feedback on this recent change. So let me know. My email and everything is available to you on our website. And our website address, you can get there a couple different ways, but patriotpowerpodcast.com or ilovegeorgewashington.com. So in our last episode, we did cover quite a bit of the French and Indian War, the key battles and the players involved during and pretty much up to its conclusion. And there have been entire books and volumes and series have been written about that particular war. So clearly we just scratched the surface, but I think you will have a good understanding of it from our last podcast, our last show. And me personally, I really find the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, I find it very interesting because there's so many amazing things that took place. And knowing what the key players were going to be like in the future, it's very interesting to see how they acted back then. And we can clearly see some decisions that people made and events that they were involved in and how it shaped who they would become in the future. So it's kind of nice to have that luxury of seeing them before and already knowing the after story of it. So we learned quite a bit. We learned the character and bravery of George Washington, especially at the Battle of Fort Duquesne, or they call it Braddock's Defeat, as that's widely known, which was pretty much a slaughter of the British Army, and that was by the hands of the French and the Indians. It was during this battle, however, that George Washington's bravery and leadership were blatantly obvious. I mean, this guy is amazing. He's 21, early 20s, and he jumped off his horse. A couple horses had been shot out from under him, but he got off his third horse, pulled General Braddock, to safety, although he ended up dying. And then he took the helm of the battle and did the best he could. So it was a crazy, amazing scene for him. Horrible battle for the British, but we also learned how badly he wanted to be an officer in Britain's army and how that never happened, which was sad for him, but great for us. I'm not sure where he would have fit in or even been on our side during the Revolution. So we can learn a lot and garner great nuggets of information from that war. And with that, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about how that all came about. So the governor of Virginia needed somebody, his name was Governor Dinwiddie. He needed somebody that would be willing and brave enough to travel a very treacherous, dangerous, and highly unlikely that you're going to come back from this trip. And he needed somebody to do it. And George Washington, 21, he stepped up and said, I'm your guy. I'll do it. And I don't think anybody really thought he was ever going to come back, let alone accomplish this, because what he was supposed to be doing was delivering a message to the French to leave at once. And greatest thing about this whole journey is that George Washington was, as many of the other founding fathers and historians even at the time, they kept a really good track of things. And his whole account of his actions in the Ohio Valley were written down, and this journey was published in 1754, and it made him a celebrity, not only in Virginia, but the entire 13 colonies, and even in Britain. So George Washington's name became synonymous with military and bravery, even though he didn't hold a position within Britain's army. He became very famous because of that journey. And it's a short read of 78 pages, and I recommend that you take a look at it. It does provide some pretty good insight into the mind of him, being 21. And, we always picture George Washington, old guy like on the dollar bill. But he was very ambitious, and he was very brave. But with that came a lot of inexperience. The one thing I think George Washington had that other founders did not was the fact that he rarely repeated the same mistake twice. He took every failure, analyzed it, and ensured that should he be put in a similar situation, that he would choose differently, act differently, or make decisions to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And I think that's an attribute of his personality that we could all benefit from. He would listen to others and seek everybody, all the top generals, and he would take their advice. And then based on all of that, he would formulate an answer. And he didn't do it just for lip service, and so he looked, hey, everybody tell me what you think, and I'm going to make a decision on my own anyway. I mean, he really valued their opinions, and he listened to it. So even back then, he did that, and it was cool to see that. During that journey, he almost lost his life twice, and he really should have died. He fell off a raft one time, and then his Indian guide, was about 20 feet away from him while they were walking through the mountains. This Indian turned around and shot at him. Missed him, thank goodness. But he could have lost his life very easily on that journey. I'm glad it didn't. But what I've done is put the entire journal on our website under our show notes, and it's in PDF form, so you should be able to pull it up on your iPad or iPhone or smartphone or whatever you use. So again, Patriot Power Podcast or ilovegeorgewashington.com, you can find that. And we also learned that the French and Indian War was officially over in February of 1763 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. A lot of people have asked me, well, isn't the Treaty of Paris the end of the war of the American Revolution? And yes, that is true. It seems to be like there's 12 Treaty of Parises. Everything was called the Treaty of Paris, it seems like. Not everything, but yes, there was more than one Treaty of Paris. And this one that took place in 1763 ended the French and Indian War, even though there was a couple other battles after that. But with this victory, Britain spent more time and more money to get the French out of North America. They won, right? So they're gonna kick them out. Well, that takes a lot of resources. It takes manpower. It takes money, and all of that just increased Britain's national debt, which was completely off the chart and skyrocketing. And I mean, keep in mind that Britain was at war in many, many places around the world at the same time as the American Revolution and at the same time as the French and Indian War. So this was just one area of the world that they were battling in and trying to, of course, increase their empire. The terms of the Treaty of Paris, they were pretty harsh to the loser, that being France, and all French territory on the mainland of North America was lost. That was huge. That was a big deal. The British received Quebec and the Ohio Valley. The Port of New Orleans and the Louisiana Territory west of the Mississippi, those territories went to Spain because they had given their efforts to Britain during the French and Indian War as an ally. So they got those areas. But the territory gained by winning the war, although it provided a tremendous amount of land, it also gave them access to really important trade routes. But in addition to all of those positives, there was some negatives. In October of that same year, 1763, King George III, he banned colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. And this was accomplished with the Royal Proclamation of 1763. I read the text of the proclamation, and I put it and a photo of the document on our website under this show note of this podcast. Side note, there's only 9 copies of this proclamation left in existence, at least that we know about. So they fought hard. They fought a long war, and they did it to get the French out and to get more land. But after they won, the British tried to keep Americans from settling in it for all this new land. And it was already hard for Britain to govern the colonies from overseas, from 3,000 miles away. But I think the British believed that if Americans moved, or the colonists moved west over the mountains, it would be too challenging to regulate trade and taxes. And that, of course, would cut into their resources. And they couldn't go after him because the resources were already spread too thin. And a lot of people didn't really care if it was a rule or a proclamation. They were already there, or they just went to the Ohio Valley on their own. The British could not afford to get into another war, so anybody that had left into that area, the Ohio Valley, they just left them alone. Native Americans who had actually helped the French during the war, they were still fighting over land even though the war was over. You know, there was a one large battle called Pontiac's Rebellion, and that went on after there was a ceasefire. And that rebellion lasted a year. The Native Americans were fighting with the British because all these people were coming west, and the Indians were already there, and they felt encroached upon, and that their land was being taken from them. Well, they felt that way because that's exactly what happened. So I can see their point, too. 450 soldiers and 2,000 civilians were killed, and 1,400 civilians were displaced. Estimates show about 200 warriors, Native Americans, died. And I think this is about the closest numbers that anybody can come to an agreement. They didn't keep astounding detailed records, but I think this is pretty close based on the 3 sources that I looked at. But a lot of people died, and this was after a ceasefire. This was after the war was over. So this Royal Proclamation, it was very unpopular with the colonists. And for those living in the colonies, creating a boundary was not helpful because it didn't address some of the biggest problems with the war. Colonists had shed blood to fight the French off and to fight the Indians. And many of them said, you know what, I put my life on the line and I have a right to go settle on the land that we won. Also, the Royal Proclamation did not account for any colonists who had already settled in the West. So it was kind of a cluster, as you can see, and imagine where those tensions would come from. The colonial governments were already kind of starting to plan an expansion into the territory. In fact, that had become a very large political issue among the colonists. Now, they're getting some steam ahead. They're talking about it. They're formulating a plan. They're getting people to engage and give in, and all this came to a screeching halt when the proclamation came and said, nope, nobody can go west. And this ticked off the colonists. They all felt that it was a plot to keep them under more control, or keep them under England's thumb. If they allowed anyone to travel west, well, they couldn't keep their eye on them. Or, more importantly, they couldn't tax them or keep track of the tax. And as a result of all this, the colonists rebelled against this law, just like they did with previous laws, and they took scores of wagons westward toward the Ohio Valley. They believed that if they acted together, it would be virtually impossible for the British to enforce the new law, which was exactly what happened. The fight between the colonists and the British over the proclamation was a hot topic, and the colonists felt like the law really didn't think about their needs. It didn't respect their need for growth or what they wanted to do as individuals, so they just ignored it and they headed off west. And you'll see that this type of thing becomes a common type of mistake that the British make. A small act or a proclamation does not always work out as intended. But what they all did do was it infuriated the colonists, and for the first time, different colonies were working together. And all of these acts, which should just be called taxes, are part of a long list of reasons which eventually I think leads up to, the actual war for independence. Back then, like I'm sure many of my listeners would say, oh, I've been to Texas, I've been to Oregon, I've been to New York, I've been X, Y, and Z, all over. Well, back then, very few people traveled from colony to colony. One, they really considered their state or their colony as their own country. So they would often say, my country of Virginia, my country of Connecticut, my country of Rhode Island. And so they were they were connected by land, but they were very isolated and separated on purpose by themselves because they didn't venture outside of their country or state. And so when these colonies started to work together, against these proclamations, it's a big deal. So you can kind of see, wait a minute now, if we all kind of jump in together and fight the same cause, collectively we can maybe accomplish more. Well, as you know, that's eventually what happens come the American Revolution. On April 5th, the year after the proclamation, since that wasn't working, Britain decided to enact the Sugar Act. It's a very short and unassuming name, but it was, in fact, a tax and included many, many, many items, not just sugar. The Sugar Act, which is also known as the American Revenues Act, it was the first direct taxation that was enforced by the Crown. Its purpose was to raise capital, get money through the Colonial Customs Service, and to give custom agents more power and latitude with respect to seizures and enforcing customs law. And because this came from an external body rather than a legislature of colonial founding, it really alarmed the leaders in Boston specifically, who felt that this act violated their British privileges. And their principal complaint was against taxation without representation, which became the rallying cry for the Sugar Act. Just as important, though, the Act's profound implications for the colonial judicial system. I mean, this act allowed British officers to try colonists who violated any of these new duties in the court in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So if you were charged with not paying the tax or breaking the law in regards to this, you would have to go to trial in Canada or Nova Scotia, right? It would not be, you would be a defendant. You would have to pay your way. You'd have to pay for the travel and expense, and then you would be not in front of a trial by a jury of your peers. It would be people that were completely strangers. It freed up the custom officers from really any responsibility, so they couldn't be sued for damages in colonial court. It was not a good idea. And as you can imagine, this added more fuel to the fire. So they're like, come on. I mean, what's going on? Well, because it was such a big deal, it just sat there and brewed, and it just made people upset. And as each day and as each year went by, I think tempers grew, and people started thinking quite a bit differently about their home country, that being Britain. But when the Stamp Act came out, that's where the true seeds of rebellion were planted in the hearts and minds of, I think, the majority of people. We'll get into the Stamp Act soon. I mentioned earlier that the Sugar Act, it included sugar, of course, but they just kind of threw in, wines, coffee, calico, export of lumber, iron, molasses. I mean, it was basically a tax to generate money for Britain to generate some income spent during the French and Indian War. So the guy's name that was in Parliament that came up with this Sugar Act, his name was Grenville, and he thought it would just be a way to have the colonists pay back some of the debt that they incurred for coming over and protecting them, right? They fought the war alongside many of the colonists, but he didn't think it was that big a deal. And really, if you look at the big picture, the tax was not very much at all. So it wasn't the amount that upset people. It was the fact that they are forcing a new tax without any representation, and nobody had a right to agree or disagree with it. So that was the big issue that I think Grenville and Parliament kind of lost sight of. To them, it was just another task that they were talking on their long docket at a meeting, and it wasn't a big deal. Well, it was a big deal to people living here. So what if a colonist broke the law, refused to pay the tax, or what have you? What would happen? Well, all disputes would be heard in British Vice Admiral courts. In other words, naval officers are going to be the one that's going to judge smuggling or tax evasion accusations, not the local people, not the local juries, not a jury of your peers. And they had the jurisdiction over such cases since the last century, but now it was easy and commonplace to remove the hearing to a local colonial court. Therefore, merchants always did this, and with the help of popular and persuasive lawyers like James Otis, they almost always won their cases in front of sympathetic juries. Now, this new law would force trials to go to Canada. And can you imagine being charged with something and then you have to go a very long ways away by ship, and you had to pay for that expense, you had to pay for the trial, and then you weren't even going to be in front of your peers? I think you can see how this would not go over very well with the colonists. So they do the Sugar Act, they do the Currency Act, they have ensured that nobody can travel west. So boom, boom, boom. I mean, we're talking small to Britain, but huge, big deals to the colonies. This was just getting started. I mean, it was crazy. The Sugar Act and the Currency Act, it was like no big deal to them. But what did some of the leaders have to say about the Sugar Act back then? So I mentioned James Otis. He was an assemblyman from Boston in 1764, and he was a very important figure. He said, "The passage of the Sugar Act set people a-thinking in 6 months more than they had done in their whole lives before." And then Edward Montagu said, "Mr. Grenville strongly urged not only the power but the right of Parliament to tax the colonies, and hoped in God's name that none would dare dispute their sovereignty." Thomas Hutchinson, who eventually became a tax collector in Virginia, he said, "You must not deprive the colonies of their right to make laws for themselves. Parliament should only make laws necessary for the empire as a whole." And my favorite quote, as you might imagine, I'm a little bit biased. This came from George Washington in 1765, and he said, "The Stamp Act imposed on the colonies by the Parliament of Great Britain is an ill-judged measure. Parliament has no right to put its hands into our pockets without our consent. And that's really how everybody felt. So this is setting us up to, guess what? There's even more acts that they come up with. So our next show is going to be exploring those additional acts that they put into place on the colonies, including the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, and many others. And all of these acts you'll find, including the ones I mentioned here, it seems to resemble dominoes. When each tile or act fell, the colonies became more angry. They also became more resolved. And probably most importantly, they started working together and getting organized as a whole, as opposed to individual colonies. So, and after we cover those acts, we're going to be delving into, are you ready? The first battles of the war, Lexington and Concord. And I have a few things that we'll be talking about that I'm guessing you may not have heard about them. Maybe you have, but they're less talked about. So I'll share that insight with you. And it's pretty exciting stuff. So again, please visit our website at patriotpowerpodcast.com or ilovegeorgewashington.com for all the show notes, photos, and links. And if you have a minute, share it with others that you know who love the American Revolution as much as we do. Also, if you are enjoying this podcast, we hope that you can spare a minute and give it a rating and leave a positive review. This does really a couple things. One, it helps get the word out to the right people who are interested in what we cover. And secondly, it increases the listenership, which just propel it to get out there and make it more accessible to everybody. So we talked about a tremendous amount of things. There's some things that you can dive in deep or read the actual Sugar Act or the Proclamation that King George III. All of this is located in our show notes under our podcast page. Until next time, be safe, be happy, and tell a veteran thanks for their service to the best country in the world.